and welcome to the Transportation Access and its Importance to Economic Mobility and Self-Sufficiency webinar. Today's call is being recorded. At this time, I would like to turn the conference over to Dr. Kristen Abner. Please go ahead.
Thank you so much. I want to welcome everyone today to this webinar, which is sponsored through the Office of Planning, Research, and Evaluation's Self-Sufficiency Research Clearinghouse, and you'll hear me refer to that as the SSRC, which is less of a mouthful. This webinar is on transportation access, and it's important to economic mobility and family self-sufficiency. I'm Kristen Abner, and I am the Library Task Lead on the SSRC project. As many of you know, transportation has long been a critical component to achieving economic self-sufficiency. With the advent of urban sprawl and the movement of high-demand jobs and growing job sectors in the suburban areas, access to affordable and public and private transportation has become an integral element of finding, attaining, and sustaining jobs. And the practice literature in the last 5 years notes that transportation is one of the single most difficult and common barriers to overcome for low-income and often minority populations, not only in maintaining gainful work, but accessing needed services such as health care. So this moderated webinar is designed to provide you all with an in-depth look at the research on how transportation barriers hinder self-sufficiency for low-income workers and provide practice and policy-based approaches for alleviating transportation barriers. We have a great lineup of speakers who are going to discuss the state of the research on transportation as a barrier to self-sufficiency and the relationship between transportation and economic and employment outcomes. They're also going to offer practice and policy perspectives on spatial mismatch, which will include actionable items for the self-sufficiency field. So we have Evelyn Bloomberg, Nicholas Klein, and Asha Weinstein Agrawal that will be joining us today. We're going to start with a quick poll question just so we have an accurate count of our participation today. So you will see it come to the front of your screen. If you can click on how many people are watching the webinar in the room with you, that would be great. Looks like folks are still clicking. Thank you very much. So before we start, and I turn this over to our speakers, I want to take a few minutes to talk about the SSRC and provide some logistical information on the webinar platform. So the link to access the SSRC is up on your screen. It's also listed if you see the web link box to your right as well. So the Self-Sufficiency Research Clearinghouse, if you're not already familiar with it, it's a virtual portal of research and other resources related to self-sufficiency. And it's designed to function as an online community for researchers, practitioners, and other stakeholders interested in self-sufficiency, employment, family, and child well-being. And the SSRC's purpose is to disseminate quality research. And you'll see we have, as of right now, if you go to our library, we have over 6,200 resources in the library. And you'll see on your screen that a keyword search on transportation returned 143 results into our library. So our library is organized around 12 topic areas related to self-sufficiency, one of which is transportation. And every item that goes into our library is reviewed by a team of researchers for relevancy to self-sufficiency, but also for methodological issues as well. We're constantly adding new resources to the library, so the number will continue to go up every single week as new resources come out in the field. Users can search by keywords, so you'll see at the top of the screen here, this was a search for transportation in the library, but we also have the search to the right, which is a faceted search. So you can filter out your search with things like the topic area to your right. We have source, we have geographic location, research methodology. So if you're looking for a randomized controlled trial, you can click on RCT and find every RCT that's in our library. I also want to point folks to our Browse Topics section on the website, and you'll see on your screen it's at the Transportation Browse Topics. We have a tab that's called Our Librarian Recommends, and it highlights research and resources recommended by our library team. And each one of these topical pages will include also relevant federal laws and regulations. But if you go to Browse Topics under Transportation, what you'll find is what we call our SSRC Selection. And these highlight research, evaluation reports, and other publications that inform the field around the key issue. So if you're looking for, I like to call these the top 10. So they have between 6 and 10 resources, kind of the top 10 resources in the field right now on a given topic. So this is a great place to look if you're looking quickly for resources on transportation and self-sufficiency. There's also a link to this in the web links box as well. Finally, I wanted to note for everyone that the SSRC houses a number of data sets and sources to support program management and facilitate improved outcomes for children, families, and communities. So you can get to our list of data sets by going to the data set and data sources page on our website. Forward. Before I talk about this slide, I noted twice when I was talking about the SSRC, the web links. So if you want to explore more on the SSRC and the places I was talking about, you can click on any of the links in the web links box, which will take you to the SSRC page. So a little bit of logistical information before we get started. While listening to the speakers today, if you have a question, please type it in the Q&A box at the bottom right of your screen. We'll address all the questions at the end of all 3 presentations. So if you have a question for a specific speaker, it would be great if you could enter in the box with your question so we can direct that question to the person directly at the end. I also want to make a social media plug. We encourage you to join today's conversation on Twitter using the hashtag SSRC webinar displayed on the screen. And before we get started, I want to do our second poll. Which of the following best describes your role? Are you a researcher, practitioner, policymaker, or other? I also very much appreciate that folks are introducing themselves in the chat box. Okay. Thank you very much. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce you all to Evelyn Bloomberg, who will start us out. Professor Bloomberg's research examines the effects of urban structure, the spatial location of residence, employment, and services on economic outcomes for low-wage workers, and on the role of planning and policy in shaping the spatial structure of cities. Her recent projects include analyses of the travel behavior of special populations groups, including low-income adults, immigrants, and youth, the effects of the economy and increasing gas prices on travel behavior and transportation assets in the low-income community, and the relationship between residential location, automobile ownership, and employment outcomes among the poor. Professor Bloomberg was a champion of change as part of President Obama's Ladders of Opportunity program because her research examines travel behavior of low-income adults, the transportation expenditure burden, and the relationship between transportation and the economic outcomes of low-income families. She holds a bachelor's degree in political science from the University of California at Berkeley and a master's and PhD in urban planning from the University of California at Los Angeles. She teaches courses on planning, history and theory, poverty and inequality, transportation and economic development, and urban policy. And with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Evelyn Bloomberg.
Thanks, Kristen. Good afternoon, or I guess good morning if you're on the West Coast where I am. As you already know from Kristen's introduction, the focus today is on transportation and economic self-sufficiency, so that's what I'm going to be talking about. It's a topic on which I've done a substantial amount of research, but today I'm not going to focus specifically on any one of my sort of own research projects, but I'm going to draw on the broader literature to give you a 15 or 20-minute sort of overview on the topic, and then I'm going to turn things over to the two other panelists, my colleagues Nick and Asha, and they're going to elaborate on some of these topics by drawing specifically on their own research projects. And then finally at the end you're going to hear again from me, so things are going to come full circle, and I'm going to talk a little bit about sort of potential policy strategies. And so that's how things are going to flow from here. So let me start right off with my overall perspective on this topic, which dovetails with the introduction that you just heard. So I believe that the principal transportation-related barrier to self-sufficiency is that there's a mismatch between the evolving urban structure of metropolitan areas and the lack of access to automobiles among some low-income workers. And so, as you might imagine, I teach and work in the field of urban planning, so this is not an argument that many of my planning friends and colleagues like very much, but I'm going to sort of play this argument out in the next sort of few minutes. So over time, what we've seen is declining proximity to employment, which, as you'll see, significantly disadvantages low-income adults who don't have access to automobiles. So I'm going to show you some data. I'm going to talk through this argument sort of largely focused around sort of 3 points. I'm going to start by talking a little bit about geographic access to employment. Then I'm going to talk very briefly about travel behavior and resources among low-income adults. And then finally, most of the time I'm going to talk about transportation's role in moderating the effects of distance, so distance to opportunities. Okay, but first, for those of you who are not transportation planners, I think it's important to start with a reminder about travel itself and why we should care about travel, although I think that you probably are a self-selected bunch since you're interested in this topic already. Economists refer to the demand for travel as derived, so a derived demand. So with the exception of things like, Sunday drives for pleasure or walks in the park, people travel to do other things or to gain access to other things like work, like going to see a doctor, like going grocery shopping, getting access to services. So, why should we care about transportation? It's these mobility-enabled activities that are key to our sort of quality of life, and that's certainly true for all of us, not just low-income workers. So let me start now with my first topic, geographic access to jobs. And so some of these graphs should look familiar to some of you. On this graph, this is data from the current population survey on the residential location of the poverty population. And what we see is that over time there's been a suburbanization of the poor, so a substantial increase in the percentage of the poor living in the suburbs of metropolitan areas. So by 2015, again, data from the current population survey, we see that 60% of the poor population lives outside of the central cities, so in the suburbs or in non-metropolitan areas, which includes things like small cities, but also rural areas as well. So at the same time, employment jobs are dispersing as well, although, and these are data from the Brookings Institution, the process certainly slowed during the recession, and we'll see what happens in the post-recession years. So the data on the slide that you're looking at is the number of jobs in millions by distance from the central business district or downtown. And you can see that there was a substantial increase in jobs, particularly jobs 10 to 35 miles from the central business district from 2000 to 2007, and a little bit of a decline from 2007 to 2010. And in general, a larger decline in the outlying areas. But still, this is what it looks like. This is the sort of the profile of job location. Only 23% of all jobs are located, close into the central business district, so within 3 miles. 43% are located 10 to 35 miles from the central city. So the data show that there are many more jobs located, sort of distant from the central cities, so in the suburbs or outlying areas of metropolitan areas. But it is really important in terms of transportation to keep in mind that suburban jobs tend to be spread out over a lot of land area. So suburbs are large, densities tend to be lower. So as this map shows, sort of densities, people and jobs remain highest in the central city. So this just happens to be a graph from a study that looked at sort of Boston. But it is important to note that job access, so thinking about these measures of job access, it tends to be, remain highest in and around the central cities. Remember, where sort of densities are highest. But overall, this goes back to works that the Brookings Institution has done. Overall, the number of jobs located near a typical resident has declined over time. And their work tends to focus in these sort of large metropolitan areas, and that's what you see here on this graph. So let me talk just a little bit about travel behavior and resources of low-income adults, and then I'll put these all together. So on this slide, you see a graph of household automobiles by poverty status. It uses sort of data from the recent 5-year American Community Survey. And we see that 20% of poor adults, so individuals 16 years or older, live in households without cars. What this graph doesn't show is that there are also more low-income households are also more likely to live in auto-deficit households, so households where there's less than a 1-to-1 ratio between adults and vehicles as well. So households, so let me sort of shift to the public transit side of things. And so households without automobiles tend to move to dense urban areas where they have access to good transit. And so there's been research on this as well, which is one of the reasons why low-income workers are more likely to commute by public transit than higher-income workers. And I'll show you some data on this in a minute. But still, and you'll see this in the following graph, it's very important to note that almost 3/4 of low-income workers commute to work by automobile. So they're more likely to use transit than higher-income workers, but still, 3/4 of low-income workers commute by automobile. So these data go sort of back again to the commute mode data from the recent 5-year American Community Survey. And you see that low-income workers are about 1.5 times as likely to use public transit than higher-income workers. The graph also shows that they're almost 5 times as likely to walk to work, by the way. But still, as I mentioned before, the vast majority gets to work in an automobile. So they're either driving the car themselves, they're borrowing someone else's car to drive, or they're carpooling. Okay, so putting it all together. So what's transportation's role in moderating the effects of distance? So first, low-income adults can access far fewer jobs by transit than by automobile. It's true for low-income adults. It's true for everyone sort of else as well. So this image goes back to the study of Boston, but I do want to note that there have been a number of studies using data from a whole variety of metropolitan areas that show this exact same thing, that households can reach many more jobs by car than by public transit. In this case, the map focuses on a 30-minute commute, and that's true no matter where they live within a metropolitan area, whether they're living in the central city or the suburbs. But certainly, transit does best in the central city, where origins and destinations are proximate. So we hear, at least in the planning circles in which I run, we certainly hear a lot about the problems with automobiles, and I certainly don't want to give those problems short shrift. There are certainly problems. They cost a lot to buy and to operate. And I think Nick will and Asha will return to this topic. There are, of course, the negative externalities that are associated with driving a car, like air pollution, climate change. There's congestion. There's sprawl. There are the public subsidies that go into supporting sort of cars and highways and roads. There are safety issues, so here focused around sort of crashes. And there are the car's impact on other sort of modes of travel as well. And the cartoon highlights some of these. But there are also many benefits of automobiles, and that's why so many people drive cars. So the big one is, and I'm going to come back to this point in a minute, is faster speeds. And so, again, sort of greater access to opportunities within some commute distance. There's the ability to make multiple trips on a single tour or in a single day. Really helps household members, largely women who are juggling household and work-related responsibilities. It also helps greatly in the job search, where you want to be contacting multiple employers, perhaps in a single day. Cars can be convenient. You can leave when you want. It gives you, provides door-to-door travel. You can carry large packages. You can, potentially travel more easily with children. You're protected from the weather. Safety can be an issue with cars as well. So cars can provide safety, again, sort of this door-to-door travel, sort of particularly for women traveling in the evening or at night. And then there are lots of studies about cars and its relationship to, pleasure and status and those sorts of benefits as well. Returning to the first point about travel time, so these figures again go back to the recent 5-year American Community Survey, and you can see that in general higher income workers have longer travel times than lower income workers, but that transit travel is about twice as long as auto travel across here. It's above and below poverty, but across income groups. So given the many advantages of automobiles, a number of scholars have hypothesized that there would be a positive relationship between cars and employment outcomes. And so in this schematic, I tried to show this relationship. So it is important to keep in mind that higher incomes, and higher incomes often come from work, from employment, higher incomes are associated with the purchase of an automobile. So, you get a job and you think, okay, now I have the money to purchase an automobile. And at the same time, as I've talked about, having an automobile can make it easier to look for and regularly travel to jobs and therefore improve employment outcomes. So you are not intended to look through the details of the slide. The point is that there have been a growing number of studies. They use different data. They use different data on different population groups in different locations that show that even controlling for the relationship between employment and purchasing a vehicle, automobiles have a strong positive effect, a positive effect on employment and on earnings, so a strong positive effect on employment outcomes. So what about sort of transit? So as I've already mentioned, sort of transit works best in very dense urban areas where origins and destinations are close together and travel times are reasonable. So it's not surprising that transit supply is also the highest in those dense urban areas. And so I just did a study sort of characterizing census tracts in the U.S. So transit supply is really concentrated in about 5% of all sort of U.S. census tracts, or sort of small neighborhoods where sort of transit supply is high. And the evidence on the relationship between transit and employment outcomes is mixed. So some studies show there is no relationship or statistically significant relationship. Some studies show a positive relationship, particularly for households that do not have access to an automobile. But I'll end with this comment, but that even in studies that actually incorporate both cars and access to transit, the outcomes show that the influence of having access to an automobile is much larger than sort of access to public transit. And so with that, I'll stop and turn it over to my colleagues, and I'll come back at the end to talk about some policy strategies.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bloomberg. This is Kristen. I'm going to give the brief overview of Nick, and then Nick, I'll turn it over to you, if that's okay.
Yeah, please.
Great. So Nicholas Klein will be joining the Department of City and Regional Planning at Cornell University's College of Architecture, Art, and Planning as an assistant professor in the fall. And his research examines the role that transportation plays in the social and economic mobility of people of color, immigrants, gays and lesbians, and low-income households over the course of many years. So I will turn it over to Nick. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kristen, and thank you to the staff of SSRC for organizing this. Thank you, Evie, for that wonderful overview. You've saved me many slides and words by giving such a thorough introduction. And thank you all for listening today. So I want to talk today about a few aspects of my research. This is part of a broader research project that I've been doing with Michael Smart, who's at Rutgers University. And we've been analyzing the transportation changes in the lives of individuals and families over many years. And today I'm going to talk about the sort of two aspects of the highlighted parts of this project below, looking at sort of car ownership over time, thinking about sort of how families go into and out of car ownership. We've also done work on sort of looking at generational changes, looking at sort of, for example, whether millennials are less likely to own cars and why that might be. We've done work on looking at housing locations and transportation expenditures. So for example, if you move to live near somewhere with high quality transit service, does that mean you can save money that you would have spent on owning and operating a car by using transit? Work on the sort of how where you grew up influences your travel behavior. And then the last part, which I'll talk about today also, is sort of thinking about the costs and the benefits of car ownership, building on the work that Evie and others have been doing. So this research project, sorry, one second. This research project it draws mostly from the panel study of income dynamics, which is a long-running panel survey of families in the U.S. It's been running since 1968. I'm sure many of you are familiar with it. It began as part of President Johnson's War on Poverty. And since 1968, it's been following the same families over time, right? So going back to them every year or every other year and asking them a number of questions, primarily questions about their expenditures, where they spend money, how they spend money, but also questions about their earnings. So what kind of jobs are they doing? How much money do they make? How do they, what different places where they work and so forth, as well as all sorts of questions they might ask in other surveys about demographics, education, and various other aspects. I'm going to talk about data from the recent waves from 1999 to 2011, but the data does go back much further than that. And there's some benefits to using this survey over other data sets, primarily that it's a long-term panel study. So it's been following these families and their descendants, and it goes back over many years. It's national in scope, so it covers everyone all sorts of different places of the U.S., different types of neighborhoods, not just one or two states or cities, and it's fairly representative. The people who maintain and administer the survey have worked very hard to ensure that it's representative. So although it started in 1968, it's been replenished with additional samples to make sure that it sort of maintains some racial and ethnic and age representativeness. So additions of various surveys and samples to help maintain that representativeness. This survey is also highlighted on the SSRC website, which I don't see showing up on my slide now. But you can find it on the SSRC page under their data sets. It's highlighted there. So I want to talk today first about thinking about car ownership over time. And talking about sort of how families go into and out of car ownership. If you hold on one second. Kristen, I'm having problems moving the slides or transitioning. I don't see the next slide. I just see a blank slide on my end.
I can see your slide, but I'm happy to move you forward. Were you on the, do you see what I just did?
No, I don't see anything on my end. I just see a blank slide for some reason.
That is very odd. I just advanced your slide to the car ownership over time, which is a graph.
Great. Okay, so that's fine. I'll happy to talk on that. Thank you.
Okay.
And I'll just tell you when to go ahead. This graph shows sort of how car ownership has changed over time, in aggregate throughout the U.S. And you can see that this is the ratio of cars to adults in a household. And it's grown steadily since 1968, since the survey started, with a possible plateauing in recent years. And there's a lot of debate among transportation scholars about sort of exactly what's happening there, whether it is a plateau, whether it's a hiccup related to the economy or what. And this car ratio is a measure of the number of cars to adults. So Kristen, if you don't mind going forward one to the next slide. So okay. I want to talk first about sort of looking at car ownership as a snapshot approach, where we look at one single time, a slice in time, and then compare that with a more longer-term view. So if we think about a snapshot approach, we can look at car ratio, and then if you go forward one slide, we can see different levels of car ownership. As Evie suggested earlier, we can think about people who have a car ratio of less than 1 as having either 0 cars or sharing cars as being sort of auto-deficit households. Right? There's fewer cars than there are adults in the household. And then above that, above 1, it's either 1 car for every adult or more than 1 car per adult. Then if you go ahead one slide. This slide shows the full sample in the panel study of income dynamics, and we can see the distribution in the U.S. Using this sample. So roughly 13% of the sample have 0 cars, and then we see that most of the households in the U.S. have more are not deficit households. If you go to the next slide, we can compare poor households with those that are not poor. And here, by poor, I mean households that are in poverty, according to the census definitions, right? And we see that these households are much more likely to be auto deficit households, with a large share of them being carless, with a car ratio of 0. And we can go to the next slide and see the same distribution, or the same analysis for U.S.-born households versus foreign-born households. And then the slide after that shows breakdown by race and ethnicity, again showing both for foreign-born, and then for primarily for non-Hispanic Black, and then for Hispanic households, we see much more representation among auto deficit households, which is what we'd expect. If we go to the next slide, we can start seeing and thinking about how this might change if we look at a long-term view. So looking at these households over the course of, say, 10 or 12 years, how can we think about car ownership and the changes in car ownership? And so if we think about this and go to the next slide, we can break it down into households that never have a car, households that sometimes have a car, and households that always have a car. And if we go to the next slide, we'll see what this looks like among the full sample, and we see that 5% of households in the full sample never have a car, right? In comparison to earlier, in the snapshot approach, we see that at any given time, 13% of households don't have a car. Over the course of 10 or 12 years, we see that there's a much smaller sample that shares a much smaller share that never have a car. And then if we go to the next slide, we can break it down again by poverty. And here I've looked at families that are never in poverty at any of the time, families that are in poverty in one or more ways, and families that are in poverty in most years. And when we see, looking at the families that are in poverty in most years, we see a huge share of the population that is sort of either never has a car or is transitioning into and out of car ownership during this time. And if we transition to the next slide, looking at it across nativity for U.S.-born and foreign-born, and then looking at it, the slide after that, across race and ethnicity, we see, again, that these groups, that the same populations, that the families in poverty, the foreign-born, and particularly the non-Hispanic Black families are experiencing much more turnover into and out of poverty. So going to the next slide, we can think about this another way, and think about this, or represented another way, and think about the probability that a household is going to switch into or out of car ownership. And if we go to the next slide, we can see sort of for these same breakdowns, sort of how likely, if we look at each family how likely that family is going to transition into or out of car ownership in the next year. And again, we see the same populations being very likely, or having a higher likelihood of going into or out of carlessness in the next year. So a house that has a car that is in poverty in most years is over 20%, has over a 20% chance of transitioning from either having a car to not having a car, or the opposite, from not having a car to having a car in the next year. So we see, when we look at it over this long-term view, we see a lot of churning in and out of car ownership. Oh, my slide started working again. So let's see. So now I want to talk about the costs and benefits of car ownership. So this work directly builds off of what Evie was talking about earlier, and looking at this asking the question of or in what ways does transportation play a role in income gains, right? And if so, how does this happen? And so I want to break this down into a couple constituent parts, similar to the way that Evie had outlined it in her schematic. Right, we can think about a couple ways that transportation could play a role. And by transportation, I mean access to public transit or access to a car, right? So getting a car or moving somewhere to be near high-quality public transit service, or if you're so lucky that a new transit line opens up on your block, what kind of benefits could that have? So one, it could lead to you getting a job, right? So you could gain employment. It could also mean that you're able to keep a job, right? It could protect someone from losing their job by ensuring that they're able to get to their job on time, to get there every day, and so forth. It could also help people move up the economic ladder, right? You could be able to, by showing up on time, you could be able to access a promotion, or with improved transportation access, you could be able to access other jobs that could offer better remuneration. So in our research, we've looked at sort of the effects of each of these questions and whether the improvements in transportation are associated with these categories associated with these types of outcomes over many years, right? And we did this analysis for families in poverty, for the full sample of people in the PSID, for families with limited education, so people who have less than a high school degree, and for female-headed households, and looking at this across different ways. And I'm going to talk about the results for families in poverty, and I'm not going to go into the details of the modeling here. I'm happy to talk about it after the presentation and get into the nitty-gritty, but suffice it to say, we controlled for a host of possible factors like education, age, work experience, various aspects of their location, and so forth. And we find, as Evie suggested, that car ownership is associated with improved outcomes across the board, and that transit access, sometimes is associated with positive outcomes, sometimes only for families without cars, similar to what Evie was suggesting. And the other thing to note here, and I'm not going to present the specific numbers here, but the effect sizes or the sort of bang for your buck of getting access to a car compared with that for improved transit access is much larger and consistently much larger for these outcomes. So the second aspect of this I want to talk about sort of is we can see that improved transportation is associated with sort of income gains and employment outcomes, but what about the cost of car ownership? One of the benefits of the panel study of income dynamics is that it includes detailed information about transportation expenditures for families. So it includes information on sort of the purchase and loan and lease prices and expenditures, insurance outlays, gasoline, repairs, parking, even taxi and transit information, though I'm not going to go into detail on them today. And so I want to present some just brief findings on here about sort of how much people spend on car ownership and compare sort of the full sample, or that means everyone, with families in poverty and just show some differences in how much they spend on transportation. And I know that Asha is going to go into this in much more detail and present more qualitative work on this after I'm done talking. So when we look at sort of the amount that these families spend on car ownership, we can see that poor families spend much less. And these figures show the numbers represent the median that each family spends. So this would be not the average. The average is much higher, but these are the sort of middle number. So if you lined everyone up from the family that spends the least to the family that spends the most, then you found the middle family. That would be these families. And we can see that poor families spend much less. Now, of course, this has to do with the fact that poor families own many fewer cars, right? And so if we look at the amount that families spend per car, we can see that poor families are spending more. The amount they spend is more similar to what non-poor families spend. It's still less. But they still spend a lot on cars for those families that do own cars. And there's a lot of variation here, right? So the bars represent the 25th to the 75th percentile of expenditures. And so some families spend very little if they're able to access a used car that is working well, and other families choose to or have to spend a lot more, whether because of maintenance or because they choose a fancy car. And Evie's talked a lot more in other work about sort of the burdens that these expenditures cost these families, right? Because a $3,700 expenditure for a poor family is not the same as it is for a more affluent family because it's a much larger share of their overall income. So I'll just close with a little bit about planning and policy implications. I know that Evie's going to talk more about this later on, and just sort of talk a little bit about here. You know, in this research, we find that carless families today may not be the carless families next year, right? There's a lot of churning into and out of car ownership over the decade that we analyze. And it's particularly true among poor and Black and immigrant families. And clearly cars and public transit both play a role in connecting individuals and jobs. Cars tend to be more effective, but they're also expensive. And for thinking about sort of policy and car, there's a lot of programs to sort of help people gain access to cars, but there's many fewer that are focused on sort of helping families maintain those cars once they have them. And this research suggests that there's a lot of families that are able to access cars, but for whatever reason, they're not able to maintain them. Maybe the high cost of repairs, or the cars they're getting are used and not very reliable, and so forth. And so maybe more support is needed to help them maintain their cars. So with that, I will close, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nick. Finally, we have Asha Weinstein. Agrawal is a professor of urban and regional planning at San Jose State University and is the director of MTI's National Transportation Finance Center, which is at San Jose State University. And her research agenda is guided by a commitment to the principles of sustainability and equity. What planning and policy tools can communities adopt to encourage environmentally friendly travel and improve accessibility for people struggling with poverty or other disadvantages? She has explored this question most likely through two substantive areas, transportation finance policy and the travel behavior of pedestrians, cyclists, and transit riders. She earned a BA from Harvard University, a Master's of Science from the London School of Economics and Political Science, and a PhD from the University of California at Berkeley. So I will turn it over to Asha. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kristen, and thanks very much to all the folks at SSRC for inviting me to contribute to today's discussion. So the way this webinar has been structured, you have been starting at the sort of biggest, most conceptual level that Evie provided some overview of what the concerns may be. Next, you heard about some of the specific quantitative data out there that we can learn from Nick about our ownership and such. And I'm going to take you down to a very, very fine-grained level for a study that is qualitative, and I'll share the results of it, looking at how do transportation costs affect very low-income people in terms of their ability to meet basic travel needs, and how is this impacting their life, their overall household budget, etc. And we don't know all that much about the specific strategies that low-income households use to manage their transportation costs while also maintaining a reasonable level and quality of mobility. So this study that was done starts to fill in that gap with this qualitative approach. So let me figure out a slide transition key. Okay, so I should mention, of course, that like any project, this one had many, many people who contributed to it. Evelyn Bloomberg was my co-PI, and we had a number of other co-authors, an anthropology faculty member at San Jose State, and students. We also worked with several social service organizations who helped us identify and recruit good interviewees for our project, and the Mineta Transportation Institute funded the work. So quickly, I'll go briefly through the study objectives and methodology, spend the most time on our findings, and then wrap up with some implications for policy and planning that flow specifically from this study before Evie gives us a bigger picture discussion on policy strategies. So to start with our study objectives. Our overall research question was, how do families manage their transportation needs given limited resources? And then we had a number of more specific questions that made up that broader research question. These topics were an interest in what are the travel behavior and transportation spending patterns of low-income folks. What do they see as the costs and benefits of alternative travel modes, so driving, transit, biking, etc.? What are the strategies that they use to manage their transportation costs at a very detailed level? And then finally, how do changing transportation costs affect them? That could be an increase in gas prices or transit fares or new tolls that appear in the region. And today I'm going to focus mostly on the first three of these more specific interview topics. So our methodology comes next. We did interviews. We did face-to-face interviews with 73 very low-income adults living in San Jose, California. The data was collected in 2009. And we recruited people at social service organizations that were serving very poor families, giving away free food, or low-income residential communities. So we did not screen people for income ourselves. We assumed that if they were a client of one of these organizations, they were someone we were interested in talking with. The interviews were conducted with a very detailed but open-ended interview guide, and we used a mix of deductive and inductive coding approaches when we came time to analyze our data, and we recorded and transcribed all of the interviews. So who were our interviewees? I don't know if this is happening to everybody, but part of the slide is off the screen for me. Just a note to those moderating the webinar. But our respondents, in terms of income, they were, as best we could tell, extremely poor. A few were homeless. Race and ethnicity-wise, about a third were white only, roughly 40% were Hispanic, and then there were smaller proportions of Asian or African American and other racial groups. Pretty even male-female gender split. In terms of age, most were between 25 and 65, so adults of sort of working age. Education, virtually all had a high school degree, and a number actually had college degrees. And finally, transit access, most lived within a quarter of a mile of a bus or rail stop. I should mention that the San Jose area where these people all lived probably falls into that one of those census areas that Evie described as having pretty good transit access. That said, it's nothing like living, in Manhattan or Boston or San Francisco. There is bus service and light rail that's pretty well spread across the region, but it's slow and often pretty inconvenient to use. So what did we learn from talking to these 73 people? And I'll start with what we learned about their travel patterns. Our interviewees made pretty frequent trips, mostly for what we might think of as non-discretionary purposes, so things that you really needed to do. So, for example, of course, these would be trips to work, but other kinds of employment, sort of livelihood-maintaining activities. People describe seeking assistance at nonprofit organizations or traveling to offices to resolve legal or financial issues or pay bills, searching for employment, shopping for food, visiting friends or family, medical trips, and school. And I should quickly explain that we got this information by basically asking everybody, tell us everywhere you went yesterday and how you got there, and walk us through your day. In terms of how people got around, many people used more than one travel mode, but and so the numbers in this little table here are not going to add up to 100 because people may have used more than one option. But as I think was becoming clear from what Abby and Nick described, even very low-income people travel a lot. In fact, most of them travel by private cars. And so we found about 61% had used a private vehicle the day before, either as a driver or passenger. That a little more than a third had used public transit. Just under a third had walked, and a small fraction, but nevertheless noticeable fraction, had bicycled. By the way, I'll just as a side note that bicycling I don't think has come up today as a topic, but I would argue should be part of what we think about when we think about mobility for low-income residents. Cost concerns. We asked people about, how they paid for transportation, how much it cost them, how it impacted them, and people were very concerned about costs. That's probably not a big surprise to this audience. One thing I will point out is they were concerned about the high costs of automobiles, of course, but also the cost of public transit. Just to share a couple of quotations from our interviews, one fellow named Jim said, can't afford the gas, insurance, upkeep on a vehicle. But turning to transit, Jennifer, we use pseudonyms, of course, Jennifer said, so how are the kids going to get the money to ride the bus for $5 a day? It's a lot. So, even the single transit fare was a barrier for some of the people we talked with. Now, the next point here, I think, is perhaps something certainly in the planning literature that is not much discussed. I'm not part of, public health and other groups where maybe this is better understood. But one of the things that came out of our research was people felt that there was just not much help for covering their transportation costs. And also that people were perhaps not aware of the help that was out there. So again, to just share one quotation, and this is actually one of the, this whole multi-year effort, one of the things that just always sticks in my mind, Craig said, I went to the Salvation Army. I went here to Sacred Heart Community Services. I went to every church up and down San Carlos. Nobody helps out with bus passes, nobody. It's like, we'll give you all this food, all this clothing, but a bus pass, no way. So again, something that I think is perhaps important sort of for the policy community to think about moving forward is how do we help people with transit expenditure costs. So moving next to what we sort of termed cost management strategies. What did people do in order to manage to get around and to afford it? So one thing they did was they changed their travel behavior. And this is what, frankly, you would expect people of any income level to do if they're trying to reduce their expenses. And there were lots of ways to do this. One was by changing their travel behavior. So, for example, they might switch to a less expensive mode, maybe from driving to transit or transit to biking. And they also tried to reduce the total number of miles that they traveled, either by shortening their trips or reducing the number of trips. So Monica, who talked about shifting mode, said, yeah, the price of gas is becoming to be a big worry. So now we kind of walk a lot because we don't, want to waste gas if we can get there by foot. Why should we waste money on gas? Jim gives an example of the sort of trip chaining people did to try and reduce the number of trips or the mileage they go. He said, if I go to the grocery store and the doctor's and the pharmacy and the food bank and go by the post office and stop at all those different places in one trip, I save a tremendous amount of money on gas by not doing a lot of short trips. A next type of strategy people use is what we titled creative cost covering. There are many approaches here. One was people using informal income generating strategies, particularly to raise money for transit. So interviewee Julio said, we do a lot of panhandling for money to get on the bus, just so we can keep our errands and make our scheduled appointments. So all the money is pretty much given to us, all people's good faith. That's how we've been on the bus every single day. And he was referring to his wife as well. People also got informal support from friends and family, people giving them rides. Maybe, our interviewee would give rides, and then passengers would chip in some money to help pay for gas. There were some people who reported getting formal support from either private or nonprofit or public organizations, free bus passes or whatnot. And we also heard people talking about evading transit fares. And, they were sort of embarrassed or sorry about this, but they had pretty specific strategies. One gentleman would simply ride late at night because the fare inspectors weren't very likely to be out then. Another gentleman we talked to described a rather elaborate plan where he and a friend would kind of finagle a bus pass and then share it between them instead of both of them independently paying for it. In this case, it was a day pass. People also manage their transportation expenditures carefully. If we just asked a more generic, theoretical question of people, do you track your transportation costs and know what they are, people would kind of be like, I don't really do that. But when we started asking them, we found out that people were extremely aware of how much gas they were buying a week, how many miles they were traveling, and such things. So people were certainly informally managing their expenditures. Finally, some of the people we talked to did say that they were reducing their non-transportation spending, specifically in order to pay for transportation. Sometimes the examples given were discretionary spending, cigarettes, cable television, eating out. But people also described reducing what I think most of us would consider non-discretionary spending. One person mentioned cell phone service, which by now I think is probably essential to sort of leading daily life for many people. But somebody else, for a couple of other people, mentioned reducing food spending. Jeward says, yeah, sometimes I won't pay for the food we need, the water bill or credit card payments, and that was in order to be able to pay for his transportation. So let me just wrap up with what I think are some of the implications for all of us who are trying to think about how do we help people get around and make this less burdensome for them. So one thing I want to stress, because I think sometimes it gets overlooked, is improving the quality of the cheaper options, such as transit or biking. So, if we want to help people spend less on transportation, it would be great if they can use the cheaper modes. But just like a high-income person, if you're low income, but the bus only comes once every hour or doesn't go where you need or you feel unsafe, it's not really an option for you, or at least not at all a good one that you want to use regularly. So certainly we need to think about these cheaper options. And again, I'll just mention bicycling as something that perhaps we can start to think more about too. But then, of course, we also just need to help people afford transportation. So this is partly making it cheaper to drive or take transit. But I also want to highlight it's not just the overall price, so to speak, but it's important to help reduce big, lumpy expenditures. And that's a little more obvious maybe with driving. Buying a car is expensive, or you have large one-time payments for maintenance or insurance or registration. Are there ways to help people pay instead in small bites? Car sharing comes to mind to me here, although we didn't talk about it in our interviews. Instead of somebody having to own a car and make all these big lump sum payments, well, car sharing potentially allows them to spend a small amount of money here or there when they have the money or particularly need access to that car. With transit, passes are a big issue that I think hasn't been well enough addressed in the United States. For most agencies, if you buy a monthly or maybe a weekly pass, you save a lot of money compared to paying individually for each of those trips. But you usually have to buy your pass as one big lump sum payment, whether $25 or $50 or whatever dollars. And for very low income people, that's a problem. You know, they can maybe come up with $5 or $10 in a day, but $50 at once is a problem. So it's important for our transit agencies to start thinking about ways to help very low-income people be able to access those discounted fares through passes. And then again, I think just outright, you know, it's valuable to think about how can we help people afford transit, whether that is giving away passes or ride tokens, or just doing a more effective job of advertising when these supports are available to people. Another implication is to think about how we can better support informal transportation networks that people may rely on. And then the researchers, among us couldn't help thinking, well, it would be nice if we had better transportation expenditure data. And you've already heard about some of the data that's out there, but it's not terribly detailed. In most cases, you certainly can't do a localized analysis to a particular city region. You're pretty much stuck looking at national trends. So with that, let me just wrap up by mentioning if any of you wanted to learn more details about our work, there are many options. Our funder, the Minetta Transportation Institute, has a report up on the web you can just download for free. Evie and I consolidated some of the key findings into a journal article. The citation is here. And then finally, here's just contact information, our email addresses, in case you wanted to follow up directly. So Kristen, I'll pass it back to you.
Thank you very much. That was really interesting. I'm going to pass the mic back over to Evelyn to conclude us with some policy implications.
Great. Thanks to everyone. So Nick and Asha talked a lot about, and I think this was Nick's work, the churning in the lives of low-income households. And there's certainly been a lot of research on the fluctuations in income, and I think that we have highlighted today that there is certainly fluctuations in relation to transportation resources in low-income families as well. And it would be important for us to think about or to establish a set of policy strategies to provide some transportation stability. And I've had the luxury to listen to both presentations, but also to read some of the chatting that is going on by all of you. And I think that one of the comments that was made is that there really is no sort of one-size solution for all households or for all neighborhoods. Someone commented about, they live in a mountain region where it would be difficult, for example, to travel by bike. Weather might be an issue, sort of time of the year. So there really isn't any sort of one-size solution for all households or for all places. So this list that, I'm about to sort of present really is intended to, talk about some basic strategies and as a springboard, hopefully, for some discussion or questions. So I think you can see on the slide, I've kind of sort of grouped them into two strategies, sort of automobile-related strategies and public transit strategies, and hopefully I've included some of the strategies that Nick and Asha already mentioned, and a few others. So the first is sort of lifting the vehicle asset limitation associated with some public benefit programs. Certainly some states have done this already. For some programs, others have not. So still, for example, a substantial number of welfare participants live in states that still maintain some kind of a vehicle asset limitation associated with their TANF program. And so it's important to look at that. But also we need to keep in mind, which is why there's a long list here, that that many low-income households are not on those programs as well, and so we need to think about a broader sort of set of policies. I think we've already mentioned, and I know some of you have mentioned this already in your chatting, that there are some automobile sort of ownership and automobile sharing programs that are out there. A number of you commented on the role of the transportation network companies, so the Ubers and the Lyfts in general, and I'll talk about this in a minute. It is better for low-income adults or households to pay for what they use. So even though an Uber and a Lyft ride can be expensive, again, better to pay by mile for things than to pay to have an automobile in your driveway, perhaps. And so, you know, the TNCs are relatively new, and so there's a lot of room for additional research about those sorts of programs as they relate to low-income families. A big issue these days are consumer protections. We focused a lot in the area of housing. Increasingly, people are focusing on the sales and financing problems that are associated with the purchase of a vehicle. Oftentimes, again, the data show a used vehicle, and so there are a lot of issues there. An issue that you know, both federally and the states are dealing with is the sort of relationship between immigrants and whether they're able to obtain a driver's license. So that's an issue, a policy issue as well. And then there, and some of the states already have this, certainly California does, you know, programs and policies to reduce the costs associated with driving. So Nick mentioned the second of these. I'm thinking about subsidies related to auto maintenance, so having an older car perhaps that drives reliably. But pay-per-mile auto insurance, there's been studies on this as well. So this goes back to my comment about the importance of paying for what you use. So the flat rates for auto insurance disadvantages low-income drivers because they tend to drive fewer miles than higher-income drivers. So pay-per-mile auto insurance is important, and there are some carriers that have this. And this finding comes out of some work I was doing on sort of residential mobility programs, so Section 8, for example. So I think we need to think very carefully about integrating our housing mobility programs and our auto or our transportation programs. I in no way wanted to imply that public transit wasn't an important mode of travel for sort of low-income households. Certainly, as I mentioned, if you don't have a car, you tend to be using, you know, transit or walking, or as Asha pointed out, biking as well. The big issue that comes up with transit, Asha also mentioned it, and you know there are a lot of surveys on this, is that most people, regardless of income, want better service. They don't want to be hanging out at the bus stop waiting for a bus. They want a greater frequency of service, which cuts down on travel time. I mean, there are other ways that transit can be improved, but that tends to be a big one. Asha just talked about this. You know, we need, and some transit agencies already have, programs to reduce the costs associated with using public transit. One point that Asha made that came out of that study is that certainly a lot of people don't know about the programs that exist, so we might start by publicizing the resources that currently exist. We can also think about, and some agencies do, you know, subsidized transit fares. And a big one that we didn't talk about on the transit side, and again it goes back to sort of paying for what you use, is sort of providing distance-based and off-peak fares as well would help low-income travelers. And then finally, this is sort of just a broader strategy that we need to kind of think about the neighborhoods in which low-income households live, and sort of address those kinds of deficits that are related to issues of transit access and walkability, whether that's you live in a hot or a very cold environment and you're thinking about the bus stop, or you're thinking about, you know, the condition of the sidewalks and safety issues as well. So we need to do that. And I'll end here. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Evie. This is Kristen. I want to thank you for that really fantastic wrap-up. I like how you kind of tied everybody together and to give us really specific implications for policy and also big, broad ones like what you were just talking about with neighborhood deficits. So we will move to the Q&A portion of the webinar. So if anyone has any questions, please feel free to type it in the box, and we'll get through as many questions as we can in the next 15 minutes. Where I want to start is folks in the chat box were talking about this, and a few came in on the Q&A box. And I think this is for you, Evie, but I think Nick and Asha, you can kind of chime in here. Do the conclusions concerning low-income adults apply to low-income youth applying for their first jobs? Any programs that can provide youth with automobiles? Did anyone talk about in your qualitative study, Asha, about youth and their kids becoming of age, getting a driver's license, and kind of challenges that would bring up in terms of finding their first job?
You want me to start?
So I'll be very quick and say no. This was Asha. That didn't come up much, but I think Evie may have more to talk about this.
Well, the car, so separate from all of this sort of work that we've been talking about today, I recently completed a couple of studies for the Federal Highway Administration on the travel of millennials. And so on the car side of things, so cars are important for everybody, including youth. So the evidence suggests that it's just helpful, particularly in terms of job search, although a lot of those studies are not youth-specific. But millennials, even though some of them are, have delayed driving in part because of state licensing regulations, it does appear, even though it will be important to wait for more current data, that youth are still sort of relying on automobiles as well. So that hasn't changed so much over time, even though there was certainly a dip during the recession. On the program, on the policy side of things, I'm not certain. I mean, there are programs, not that many of them, to help individuals get automobiles. And I'm not certain whether any of them focus specifically on youth related to their first jobs. But I would, since oftentimes, not always, but oftentimes youth live with their parents and are returning, young adults in greater numbers, even after periods away, are returning to live in households. So some of those residential location patterns apply to them as well, and having access to, maybe not ownership, but having access to a vehicle will help with the search and employment stability.
Great, thank you. The next question is around partnering with car dealers. In your research, have any of you all seen programs that have given access to cars by a partnership with a dealership?
So there are some, and maybe some of them are listening online, there are some low-income automobile ownership programs that also serve as dealers as well, as a conduit for the vehicles themselves. On the dealer side. So that's the only thing that comes to mind. There may be, actually, if someone knows of any of those programs, it would be, maybe they could chat about them. There is some interest, certainly in California, I don't know how widespread, but to think a little bit more about, not so much, it relates to the dealers, but, to think about what can be done on the financing side of things to help low-income households with the purchase of a vehicle. And I will say that those efforts, they come from the California Air Resources Board, the goal is to try to reduce the number of gross polluting, the older vehicles that are gross polluters in the state. So they are sort of focused on thinking about how to help incentivize low-income households to give up those cars and either rely on some other mode, including shared mobility, or to purchase a cleaner fuel vehicle.
Great, thank you. I want to kind of bring this to, folks have been talking a little bit about childcare. A question came in on, are you all aware of any research in the area of transportation and the cost both, I think, monetary and time related to dropping kids at childcare? I'll chime in here. This is Kristen. There may be some research on SSRC in that area, and what we can do is when we will post the webinar Q&A on the SSRC library, and we can do some digging around on the SSRC library to see if there's any research in that area.
Yeah. So this is Evie again. I'm not certain about child care specifically. So there are growing bodies of sort of literature on the relationship between, so we talked, at least I did, talked a lot about employment. There's a body of literature that looks at the relationship between transportation and access to healthy foods, so full service grocery stores, and so there's some research in that area. And some research on the relationship between transportation and access to healthcare services of one kind or another. And those are the largest bodies of literature. Although we do know, so going back to some of the advantages of the automobile, that one challenge, and it still is, sort of largely for women who bear sort of still sort of the lion's share of the household responsibilities in most households, and that comes from data from the Time Use Survey. We know that having sort of close proximity to child care, job market, all of those things are very helpful, but that cars play an important role in juggling the various things that parents have to do to manage a household, which includes this household serving travel, trips to child care, or increasingly, there's work on the another area, so growing areas on the relationship between transportation and access to schools. So many school districts are going down the school choice, right, giving households a choice of where they can send their schools, and that also has implications for transportation.
Thank you very much. I want to ask one last question, and I'll say to everyone that has asked the question, we will again be posting the questions, and we'll reach out to our speakers for additional answers that we didn't have time to get on this webinar, and we'll be posting it on the SSRC website. So somebody asked that, so I'm going to read it word for word. I think sometimes there's a friction between transit and highway, even at the federal level, that affects policy and practice. How can we help policymakers at federal and local levels see the importance of both transit and highways? It doesn't have to be or should be an either or challenge.
This is Asha, and I think that's an excellent point. Yes, these are often sort of separate turfs. I think there is quite a bit of awareness within the transportation community that this is not a productive way, and we would all like to work together more, but change is slow. One thing that I actually think those of you who are not in transportation could do to help that process along is whether it's, you're convening a task force to help your clients get around or you're doing a research project is to bring the two modes together yourself in the context of whatever planning or policy or research project that you're doing, and be sort of the change agent, be the convener who's bringing people from these different sectors together to focus on whatever the issue at hand is.
If I could just add on to what Asha was saying, and I think that's a great point, I think this might be true for Asha and Evie. I think as transportation researchers, the three of us, think mostly about the people and sort of their needs and what the role of transportation is in their lives, and less about the specific mode or vehicle type. And I think that sort of this is one way, reframing maybe what Asha was saying, but to sort of think about the conversation in those terms about what those people might need, and whether it's at the local level of an individual street, to reframe and reshape the street to enable buses to operate more quickly, to allow bikes and pedestrians to use the street safely, and to think about it that way as opposed to just sort of framing it as a people are as opposed to highways versus transit, because I think, as we all know, people often use different modes at different times in their lives, or day even.
I think it's a really, really good point. And I would just go back to saying that it's, there really isn't, if we're, no one size fits all. If we're thinking about the transportation needs of low-income households in the U.S., they live in different places. Individuals have, and individual households and families have different needs. And as Nick just pointed out, there are different kinds of, trips, sort of even, and that can vary by, during the day, over the course of the week, or whatnot. And so I think, and I'm not exactly sure how we go about doing this, but it is really important that we think about a, sort of a set of policies, sort of foundational policies that integrate both automobiles and public transit. And then on the automobile side is, again, a number of you have noted, I think we need to sort of move beyond thinking about auto ownership to thinking about access to automobiles. And I know that some of the public transit agencies, for example, are thinking about the integration between sort of public transit and, Lyft, for example, or the transportation network companies. And so we need to think about an integrated set of policies.
Thank you. And with that, we will close our webinar. I want to give a really big virtual round of applause to our speakers. Thank you so much for your relevant information that you all provided on this webinar. It's really the heart of the SSRC to translate research to practice. So I really appreciate your thoughtful insight and research. So thank you, everybody, and we will adjourn the webinar.
Thanks, everyone.